Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This mantra echoes through every corner of the galaxy, carved into the very bones of reality itself. It is a universe where mercy is weakness, where compassion is heresy, and where the very notion of friendship between opposing species would be considered not just impossible, but obscene. And yet, within this cosmos of endless conflict, where humanity's superhuman defenders wage eternal crusades against the Xenos threat, there exists a story that defies everything we think we know about the Warhammer 40,000 universe. This is the tale of an orc and a space marine who, against all odds, against all doctrine, against the very nature of their existence, found something that transcended the boundaries of species and war. And it is a story that challenges our understanding of what it means to be human, to be alien, and to find connection in the most unlikely of places. To understand how extraordinary this friendship truly is, we must first journey into the depths of what makes these two species what they are, and why the very concept of their alliance should be impossible. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is not kind to stories of cross-species understanding. It is a setting where the Imperium of man, spanning 1,000,000 worlds and countless trillions of souls, operates under a doctrine of absolute xenophobia. The alien is not merely the enemy. The alien is an abomination, a corruption of the natural order that must be purged with bolt and flame. This is not mere prejudice born of ignorance. It is codified doctrine, written into the very foundation of imperial law, taught to every citizen from the moment they can comprehend language, and burned into the psyche of every space marine through decades of hypno-indoctrination. And on the other side of this cosmic divide stand the orcs, perhaps the most successful species in the entire galaxy. These massive, green-skinned warriors exist for one purpose alone: conflict. They do not build empires in the traditional sense. They do not seek peace or prosperity. They are, quite literally, living weapons created millions of years ago by an ancient race known as the Old Ones, designed to fight in a war that ended long before humanity even crawled from the primordial ooze of ancient terror. The orcs are violence made manifest, a species that reproduces through spores, and that grows larger and stronger with each battle, and whose very belief in their own mythology shapes reality through a collective psychic field. These two species should be incapable of anything resembling friendship. The Space Marines are the Emperor's angels of death, transhuman warriors whose bodies have been enhanced by 19 separate implanted organs, whose minds have been conditioned through hypnotic suggestion and chemical treatment to view all Xenos as targets for extermination. The orcs are brutal, savage creatures who live only to fight, whose idea of a good time is wading through enemy ranks with crude but effective weapons, laughing as they crush skulls and break bones. Between these two, there should be only one relationship, that of the hunter and the hunted, the killer and the killed. But this is the story of an exception, a singular, remarkable exception that proves that even in the darkest of universes, even where hope itself is a dying light, something beautiful and unexpected can emerge from the chaos. The nature of the greenskin. To understand the magnitude of this friendship, we must first comprehend what an orc truly is. These are not creatures in the conventional sense. They are not animals that evolved on some distant world, nor are they aliens in the way we might typically imagine them. The orcs are, fundamentally, weapons. Living, breathing, thinking weapons, created through biological engineering so advanced that even the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of Mars who maintain the Imperium's technology, can only begin to understand its intricacies. The orcs were originally known as the Krork, a massive warriors standing up to 12 meters tall, clad in sophisticated armor that would have been impressive even by the standards of the Great Crusade. These original Krork were created by the Old Ones, one of the most ancient and powerful races the galaxy has ever known, as part of their desperate last stand against the Necrons and their star god masters, the Citan. This was during a conflict known as the War in Heaven, a galactic conflagration so catastrophic that it literally reshaped reality itself and gave birth to the warp as we know it today. Over the 60 million years since that ancient war, the Krork have devolved, or perhaps evolved, into the orcs we know in the 41st millennium. They are smaller than their ancestors, standing between 7 and 8 feet tall on average, though the largest war bosses can reach heights that rival even space marines. They are hunched and brutish in appearance, with massive arms ending in taloned fingers, skin the color of deep green forests, and jaws filled with sharp teeth that they use as currency among their own kind. But it is not their physical form that makes orcs so remarkable. It is what lies beneath that green skin, the biological miracle of their existence. An orc is a fusion of animal and fungus, a symbiotic relationship so complete that it creates something entirely unique in the galaxy. Their blood is not truly blood as we would understand it. Instead, it is a slurry of chlorophyll and fungal organisms, giving it a green color that matches their skin. This fungal aspect grants them abilities that border on the miraculous. Or an orc can survive injuries that would kill any other species. Lost limbs can be reattached through the crude surgeries of their medical caste, the pain boys. Wounds that would be mortal to a human merely slow an orc down, and their regenerative capabilities mean that unless they are burned to ash or their head is completely destroyed, they will likely recover given enough time. This resilience is not born of any particular toughness in their cellular structure, but rather from the fact that their bodies simply do not require many of the organs that other species find essential. The fungus that makes up part of their being has simplified their internal anatomy to such a degree that there are fewer vital areas to target, fewer ways to inflict truly lethal damage. More remarkable still is their method of reproduction. Our orcs do not procreate in any conventional sense. They release spores constantly throughout their lives, microscopic particles that drift on air currents and embed themselves in soil. These spores grow into a variety of different organisms, creating an entire ecosystem wherever orcs travel. The smallest are squigs, fungal creatures that serve as food, beasts of burden, or even ammunition, depending on their variety. Next come the snotlings, tiny green creatures with minimal intelligence that tend the fungus farms and perform the most basic labor. Then the Gretchen, larger and more intelligent, who serve as servants, mechanics, and cannon fodder. And finally, after enough time and the right conditions, full-grown orcs emerge from the ground, already possessing instinctive knowledge of their role in orc society. This means that orcs are nearly impossible to fully eradicate from a world. Even if every visible orc is killed, their spores have already contaminated the environment. Within weeks or months, new orcs will begin emerging from the soil, drawn together by instinct to form new warbands. It is a reproduction strategy that has allowed them to spread across the entire galaxy, infesting countless worlds and ensuring that no matter how many orcs are killed in battle, more will always rise to take their place. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of orc biology is what is known as the Gestalt psychic field. Individually, orcs possess no psychic ability. They cannot manipulate the warp, cannot see the future, cannot move objects with their minds. But collectively, when enough orcs gather together, something remarkable happens. Yet they generate a psychic field that grows stronger with their numbers and their collective belief. This field has tangible effects on reality itself. This is why orc technology, which should not work by any rational understanding of physics or engineering, actually functions. Their vehicles are crude assemblages of scrap metal and looted Imperial technology, held together with rivets, hope, and sheer belief. By all rights, an orc truck should not be able to run without fuel. An orc shooter should jam after the first shot. An orc rocket should explode on the launch pad. And yet they work, because the orcs believe they will work, and that collective belief makes it so through the Gestalt field. This field also explains one of the most curious aspects of orc culture, their belief that red vehicles go faster. To an outside observer, this is obvious nonsense. Paint cannot affect the mechanical performance of an engine, and yet, when an orc paints his vehicle red, and genuinely believes it will be faster, the gestalt field makes it so. The vehicle actually does move faster, not through any change in its physical components, but because reality itself bends slightly to accommodate orc belief. The gestalt field also has social functions within orc society. It allows orcs to instinctively recognize hierarchy, to know who is bigger, and therefore who should be in charge. This is not merely a matter of physical size, though that plays a role. It is a psychic understanding of dominance, a sense of who has won the most fights, who has the most victories, who embodies the ideals of orc culture most completely. This field grows stronger as orcs gather in larger numbers, and creating a feedback loop where more orcs attract more orcs, which makes the collective stronger, which attracts even more orcs. This is how the Great Orc Crusades begin. A particularly large and successful war boss starts gathering followers. His victories attract more orcs, whose presence makes him even more powerful through the gestalt field, which leads to greater victories, which attracts still more orcs. Eventually, this snowball effect creates what the orcs call a great war migration, a massive gathering of orcs drawn from across entire sectors of space, all converging on a single leader. These crusades are unstoppable forces that can overwhelm entire imperial sectors, crushing planets and fleets in tides of green-skinned violence. But despite all of this, despite their brutal nature and their existence as living weapons, our orcs are not mindless. They possess intelligence, even if it is alien and difficult for humans to understand. They have culture, art in their own crude way, and complex social structures. They feel emotions, though these are often simplified and exaggerated compared to human feelings. They experience joy in battle, satisfaction in victory, frustration in defeat, and something that might be called friendship, though it is usually expressed through the orc ideal of finding a good opponent to fight. The orcs are divided into clans, each with its own distinct culture and preferences. The Goths are the largest and most aggressive, living only for direct combat, and viewing anything less than a full frontal assault as unworthy. The Evil Sons are obsessed with speed, covering their vehicles in red paint and racing into battle. The Bad Moons are wealthy and ostentatious, their teeth growing faster than other orcs and giving them a steady supply of the currency that orc society runs on. The Death Skulls are looters and scavengers, believing that blue is the luckiest color and covering themselves and their equipment in it. The Snakebites are traditional, rejecting advanced technology in favor of ancient orc ways and riding into battle on giant beasts. And then there are the Blood Axes. The Blood Axes are viewed with suspicion by other orc clans, considered almost un-orcy in their approach to warfare. They were the first clan to encounter the Imperium of Man during the Great Crusade, and in that encounter, they learned something that other orcs refused to acknowledge. Sometimes, tactics and strategy can be as effective as raw violence. The Blood Axes use camouflage, and even if their idea of camouflage is often too bright to be effective by human standards, they actually retreat when losing, seeing it not as cowardice, but as a tactical withdrawal so they can return with greater numbers. Most controversially, they have been known to work as mercenaries for other races, including the Imperium itself, trading their services for teeth, weapons, and the promise of good fights. It is among the Blood Axes that we find the most likely candidate for an orc capable of forming a genuine connection with a space marine. A Blood Axe orc has been exposed to human tactics and culture. He understands, at least in a rudimentary way, that there are different approaches to warfare beyond simply charging at the enemy and hoping for the best. He might even have learned a few words of Gothic, or the common language of the Imperium, picked up during raids or mercenary work. He is still an orc, still driven by the need for combat and victory, but he possesses a flexibility of thought that other clans lack. This is important because forming any kind of connection with a space marine would require an orc capable of seeing beyond the immediate violence, beyond the simple equation of enemy equals target. It would require an orc who could recognize something worthy of respect in an opponent, who could appreciate skill and honor even in one who should be nothing more than another skull to claim. The Blood Axes, for all that other orcs view them as strange and untrustworthy, possess this capacity in a way that other clans do not. The Angels of Death. If the orcs are weapons forged by ancient aliens, then the Space Marines are weapons forged by the Emperor of mankind himself. But where orcs are grown from spores and emerge from the ground with instinctive knowledge already implanted in their genetic code, Space Marines are made through a process so brutal, so transformative, that it can only be called a rebirth. The young men who enter the recruiting halls of the Adeptus Astartes do not simply become enhanced soldiers. They become something beyond human, something post-human, transhuman warriors, whose very existence represents humanity's desperate bid for survival in a hostile galaxy. The process begins with selection. Space Marine chapters recruit from specific worlds, often death worlds, where only the strong survive, or hive worlds, where life is cheap and violence is common. The aspirants are young, usually in their early teens, as because the transformation process can only succeed on bodies that have not yet fully matured. These candidates are tested in ways that would kill ordinary humans, forced to prove their worth through trials that measure not just their physical capabilities, but their mental fortitude, their capacity to endure suffering, and their absolute dedication to the Emperor and the chapter. Most candidates die during these trials. This is not a flaw in the process, but an intentional feature. The Space Marines seek only the absolute best, the cream of humanity's crop, and they are willing to sacrifice hundreds of aspirants to find the handful who possess the qualities necessary to become Astartes. Those who survive the initial trials face something even more harrowing: the implantation of the gene seed. The gene seed is the genetic legacy of the Primarchs, the 20 superhuman sons the Emperor created during the dark days before the Great Crusade. Each Space Marine chapter descends from one of these Primarchs, and each possesses gene seed derived from their genetic father. This gene seed consists of 19 separate organs that must be implanted into the aspirant's body over a period of years, each one requiring extensive surgery and lengthy recovery periods. These organs fundamentally alter every system in the human body, rebuilding it from the inside out. The secondary heart, implanted first, gives the Space Marine redundancy in his cardiovascular system. If one heart is damaged, the other can take over, allowing him to continue fighting even with injuries that would kill a normal human. The os modular alters his skeletal structure, making his bones grow denser and harder, able to withstand impacts that would shatter ordinary human bones. The biscopia dramatically increases his muscle mass and density, giving him strength far beyond normal human limits. The hemastamen changes his blood, making it more efficient at carrying oxygen and allowing him to function in environments that would suffocate a normal person. The Laraman's organ produces cells that rapidly clot wounds, meaning that a Space Marine can continue fighting even with injuries that would leave an ordinary soldier bleeding out in minutes. The catalepsian node allows him to sleep with half his brain at a time, effectively going days without real rest. The preomnor is a pre-stomach that can neutralize toxins, allowing him to eat almost anything organic and survive environments filled with poison. The omophagia allows him to absorb the memories of anything he eats by consuming its genetic material, turning the act of eating into a form of intelligence gathering. And this is only a partial list. There are organs that enhance his senses, organs that allow him to spit acid, organs that create a layer of natural armor beneath his skin, organs that let him survive in the vacuum of space for limited periods. By the time the implantation process is complete, the young man who entered the chapter's halls no longer exists. In his place stands something that is technically still human, but has been so fundamentally altered that he bears only a passing resemblance to the species he was born into. But the physical transformation is only half of the process. The psychological conditioning is equally important and equally transformative. As the aspirant's body changes, his mind is subjected to intense hypno-indoctrination, a process that uses hypnotic suggestion, psychoactive chemicals, and subliminal conditioning to reshape his entire personality. He is taught to revere the Emperor as a living god, the father of humanity, and the only being worthy of worship. He is taught absolute loyalty to his chapter, to view his battle brothers as the only family he will ever need, and to see any threat to the chapter as a personal insult that demands immediate and violent response. And he is taught to hate Xenos with a passion that transcends mere bigotry or prejudice. This is not simple racism. This is a deep, fundamental understanding that the alien is the enemy of humanity, that Xenos cannot be trusted, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be allowed to exist. Every Xenos species is a threat, whether obvious like the Orcs or subtle like the Eldar. The only good Xenos is a dead Xenos, and even then, their bodies should be burned to ensure no taint remains. This conditioning is reinforced constantly throughout a Space Marine's life. The battle litanies they chant before combat, the prayers they offer to the Emperor, the rituals they perform when maintaining their weapons and armor, all of these serve to continuously reinforce the doctrine that has been implanted in their minds. A Space Marine does not merely follow orders to kill Xenos. He does so with absolute conviction, with the certainty that what he does is righteous and necessary, that every alien he cuts down is a service to humanity and the Emperor. The result is a warrior without equal in the galaxy. And the Space Marine is strong enough to punch through ceramite armor, fast enough to dodge bullets, and tough enough to survive wounds that would kill any ordinary soldier 10 times over. He is trained in every form of combat, from melee to marksmanship to orbital drop assaults. He is equipped with power armor that further enhances his already superhuman capabilities, turning him into a walking tank that can wade through enemy fire while dispensing death with bolt weapons that fire explosive rounds designed to penetrate armor and detonate inside the target. But more than his physical capabilities, it is his mental state that makes him so effective. A Space Marine knows no fear, not because he has been made immune to the emotion, but because his conditioning has taught him to master it completely. He can look at a charging horde of orcs, see his own inevitable death in their numbers, and respond not with panic, but with cold calculation about how best to take as many enemies with him as possible. He does not question orders. He does not hesitate. He does not suffer from post-traumatic stress or battlefield fatigue. He is the perfect soldier, engineered and conditioned to be exactly that. And yet, for all their transhuman nature, Space Marines are not truly inhuman. They still possess emotions, though these are often muted or channeled into acceptable forms. They still form bonds with their battle brothers, friendships forged in the fires of countless battles. They still feel pride in victory, frustration in defeat, satisfaction in a job well done. The conditioning has not erased their humanity so much as focused it, but channeled it into a form that serves the Imperium's needs. There are variations between chapters, of course. Each Primarch passed on not just his genetic legacy, but certain personality traits to his sons. The Space Wolves retain a fierce individualism and a connection to their homeworld that other chapters would view as weakness. The Blood Angels struggle with the genetic flaw in their gene seed that gives them both incredible artistic ability and a terrible bloodthirst that can overwhelm their rational minds. The Dark Angels are secretive and obsessed with redeeming ancient failures that most of the Imperium knows nothing about. And then there are the Salamanders, perhaps the most unusual chapter in the entire Adeptus Astartes. The Salamanders, sons of the Primarch Vulcan, maintain connections to their families even after becoming Space Marines. They live among the people of their homeworld Nocturne during times of peace, working as craftsmen and artisans, teaching and protecting the common citizens. They view their role not as overlords or distant protectors, but as the shield that stands between humanity and the darkness. The Salamander's gene seed gives them certain distinctive features. Their skin becomes coal black, their eyes glow red like embers, and they possess an unusual resistance to fire and heat. But more importantly, their Primarch passed on to them something that many chapters have long since forgotten: compassion for regular humans. While other Space Marines might view civilians as mere numbers, acceptable casualties in the Emperor's wars, the Salamanders see every human life as precious, but worth protecting even at great cost to themselves. This compassion is not weakness, and the Salamanders are quick to demonstrate this to any enemy foolish enough to mistake their humanity for softness. They are some of the most skilled close combat specialists in the Imperium, masters of flame weapons and thunderhammers, willing to wade into the thickest fighting to protect those who cannot protect themselves. But it is their retention of empathy, their ability to see ordinary humans as people rather than resources, that makes them unique among Space Marine chapters. It is also what makes them the most likely chapter to produce a warrior capable of seeing past his conditioning, of recognizing something worthy of respect, even in a Xenos. A Salamander has been taught to value life, to see the worth in protecting the weak. These teachings are meant to apply only to humans, but the capacity for empathy, once awakened, is not so easily confined to a single species. A Salamander who could look past the green skin and brutal exterior, who could recognize intelligence and honor in an enemy, might be capable of something that should be impossible: friendship with an orc. But even for a Salamander, this would require extraordinary circumstances. The conditioning runs deep, and the hatred of Xenos is not merely taught, but burned into the very core of a Space Marine's being. It would take something remarkable, some series of events so unlikely that it borders on miraculous, to create conditions where a Space Marine could overcome his indoctrination enough to see an orc as anything other than a target for extermination. And yet, the galaxy is vast, and in its vastness, even the impossible sometimes becomes real. The planet of ash and iron. The world that would become the meeting place for this unlikely friendship had no name in Imperial records, merely a designation: Sigma Tertius 7. It was a mining world, one of countless thousands scattered across the Imperium, valuable only for the rich veins of iron ore and other minerals buried in its crust. The planet's surface was largely barren, covered in volcanic ash from centuries of industrial mining that had destabilized the planet's mantle. Great ash storms swept across the continents with regularity, turning the sky grey and making any form of agriculture nearly impossible. The population, what remained of it, huddled in underground hive cities carved into the rock itself. These were miserable places, even by the standards of Imperial hive cities. The air was thick with particulate matter from the mining operations. The workers labored in shifts that seemed to blur together into one endless cycle of work, sleep, and prayer. Most would never see the surface, living and dying in the same cramped hab blocks where their ancestors had lived and died for generations. The mining operations were overseen by a cadre of tech priests from the Adeptus Mechanicus, servants of the machine god, who valued the minerals extracted from Sigma Tertius 7 for the war effort. The iron pulled from the planet's depths would become armor plating for Imperial Guard tanks, structural components for warships, the raw material that kept the Imperium's war machine functioning. To the Mechanicus, this made Sigma Tertius 7 valuable. To everyone else, as it was simply hell with a breathable atmosphere. It was to this world that an Orc war fleet arrived in the early months of 997 M41. The Orcs were drawn by the faint traces of metal they detected from orbit, by the promise of salvage and the prospect of a good fight. The fleet was not particularly large by Orc standards, perhaps a dozen ramshackle cruisers and twice that many smaller vessels, all held together with scrap metal, rivets, and the Orcs' fundamental belief that their ships would hold together long enough to reach their destination. The Orc force was led by a war boss named Grotzag, a particularly large blood axe who had distinguished himself through a series of successful raids on Imperial convoys. Grotzag was unusual among Orcs, even by blood axe standards. He had actually learned to speak Gothic reasonably well. In picking up the language during his time working as a mercenary for a rogue trader, who asked no questions about who he hired as long as they could fight. This experience had given Grotzag a perspective on the galaxy that most orcs lacked. He understood that sometimes you could get more loot and better fights by talking first and shooting later. But Grotzag was still an orc, and orcs need to fight. The war fleet descended upon Sigma Tertius 7 with the subtlety of a meteor strike, their drop pods and landing craft slamming into the ash-covered surface with enough force to shake the underground hive cities. The Planetary Defense Forces, a motley collection of PDF troopers, armed with equipment that would have been obsolete 200 years ago, attempted to mount a defense. Whilst they lasted approximately 43 minutes before the orc advance reached the primary hive entrances, the tech priests, recognizing that the planet would fall without significant reinforcement, sent out a distress signal. This signal was picked up by a passing Space Marine strike cruiser, the Eternal Flame, a vessel belonging to the Salamanders chapter. The strike cruiser had been en route to another war zone, but the ship's captain, a veteran sergeant named Vulcan Heastan, decided that the threat was significant enough to warrant investigation. A single company of Salamanders, 100 Space Marines, launched from the Eternal Flame and descended upon Sigma Tertius 7 in a series of drop pod assaults. Among these warriors was Brother Sergeant Hephaeston, a veteran of 2 centuries of warfare. And Hephaeston was typical of the Salamanders in many ways. His skin was the deep black of volcanic rock, his eyes glowed like coals in the darkness, and his armor was decorated with the fire drake insignia of his chapter. He carried a master-crafted power hammer, a weapon he had forged himself during his time as a neophyte, and a heavy flamer mounted on his left vambrace for dealing with enemies at close range. But what made Hephaeston unusual even among his own chapter was his capacity for curiosity. Most Space Marines viewed every battle as a simple equation: identify the enemy, engage the enemy, destroy the enemy, move to the next objective. Hephaeston, while no less effective in combat, found himself wondering about the enemies he fought. What drove them? What did they believe? How did they see the universe? Well, these questions never interfered with his duty. When the time came to pull the trigger, he did so without hesitation. But in the brief moments between battles, he thought about things that most Space Marines would never consider. Hephaeston's drop pod slammed into the surface of Sigma Tertius 7, approximately 3 kilometers from the primary hive entrance.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer lore on this channel for quite a while. There's something profoundly human about finding connection in the most impossible circumstances. And I think that's what makes Warhammer 40K so compelling, right? Beneath all the grimdark, beneath the endless war and the brutality, there are these moments that remind us what we're actually fighting for. When I first discovered this story, I'll admit, I was skeptical. An orc in a Space Marine, it seemed too optimistic for this universe. But the more I researched it, the more I realized it's not about optimism at all. It's about 2 individuals making impossible choices, choosing to see beyond what they've been taught. Even when everything in their world tells them it's wrong, that takes real courage. But anyway, let's get back to our story.
The landing was rough, the pod's retro thrusters barely slowing its descent before it impacted the ash-covered ground hard enough to create a small crater. The doors blew off with explosive charges, and Hephaeston emerged into the grey morning of Sigma Tertius 7, his power armor's sensors immediately beginning to catalogue threats. The orcs had already breached the hive entrance. Smoke rose from the massive gates, and the sounds of combat echoed from within the underground city. Hephaeston gathered his squad, 10 Space Marines including himself, and began moving toward the entrance, at a ground-eating run that would have left an ordinary human gasping for breath within seconds. They encountered their first orc resistance approximately halfway to the hive. A mob of orc boys, perhaps 30 strong, emerged from a wrecked mining facility, their crude weapons spitting bullets in the Salamander's direction. Hephaeston's squad responded with the practiced efficiency of warriors who had fought together for decades. Bolters roared, each shot carefully aimed, each explosive round finding its target with lethal precision. The orcs, to their credit, did not retreat. They charged forward, howling their battle cries, eager to close to melee range where their superior numbers might count for something. They never reached the Salamanders. Hephaestan's heavy flamer bathed the front ranks in promethium fire, and the orcs burned. Behind him, his squad continued their advance, walking through the flames without flinching, their armor protecting them from heat that would have killed an ordinary human in seconds. The surviving orcs, fewer than a dozen now, finally broke and ran, a rare act of self-preservation that spoke to the effectiveness of the salamander's assault. The entrance to the hive was a charnel house. Dead PDF troopers lay scattered across the rockcrete floor, their bodies torn apart by orc weapons. The orcs had pushed deep into the hive, following the sounds of fleeing civilians deeper into the underground structure. Hephaestan could hear the screams echoing from the depths, the sounds of people dying, and something inside him, that spark of compassion that made him a salamander, demanded that he do something about it. His squad descended into the hive, following the trail of destruction the orcs had left behind. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, exactly the kind of combat that played to both orc and salamander strengths. In the narrow corridors of the hive, numbers mattered less than skill and firepower, and the salamanders possessed both in abundance. Hephaestan led from the front, his power hammer crushing orc skulls, his flamer turning choke points into killing zones. It was in one of these narrow corridors, deep in the heart of the hive, that Hephaestan found himself separated from his squad. An orc explosive device had collapsed part of the tunnel ceiling, blocking his path back to his brothers. He tried to raise them on the Vox. But the thick rock walls and the metal infrastructure of the hive created too much interference. He was alone, cut off from support, with orcs somewhere ahead and behind him. For a space marine of any other chapter, this would have been merely an inconvenience. He would simply continue forward, killing anything that got in his way until he either reached his objective or found a way to reunite with his squad. But Hephaestan could still hear the screams of civilians somewhere in the distance, and he knew that every moment he delayed was another moment those civilians were dying. He made a decision that would have been impossible for most space marines. Rather than proceeding with tactical caution, he began moving quickly through the hive's maintenance tunnels, using his armor's auspex to track the source of the screaming. And his primary objective became not the elimination of the orc threat, but the protection of civilian lives. It was this decision, this moment of prioritizing rescue over extermination, that set in motion the events that would lead to the impossible. The meeting Grotzag had been having a frustrating day. The initial assault on the hive had gone well enough, the human defenders folding like wet paper once the boys got properly stuck in. But then those damn space marines had arrived, and everything had gotten complicated. Grotzag had fought space marines before, enough times to know that they were nothing like the regular Hume soldiers. Space marines didn't break, they didn't run, they just kept coming, methodically cutting down boys with their fancy guns and their heavy armor. What the worst part was that they were ruining what should have been a good fight. The plan, such as it was, had been to loot the hive, maybe capture some Humies to trade for more teeth with the Bad Moons, and then move on to the next target. Simple, straightforward, and profitable. But now Grotzag found himself trying to manage a fighting retreat through the hive's tunnels, trying to keep his boys from panicking and running straight into the Space Marine guns. He had split off from the main mob with a handful of his toughest boys, thinking they could circle around behind the Space Marines and hit them from an unexpected angle. It was proper cunning, exactly the kind of tactical thinking that made the Blood Axes effective. But somewhere in the maze of tunnels, he'd gotten separated from even that small group. And now he was wandering through maintenance corridors that seemed to twist back on themselves in ways that made no sense even by orc standards. Then he heard the screaming. Human screaming, high-pitched and terrified, the kind of sound that usually meant civilians had stumbled into orc raiders. Grotzag's first instinct was to head toward it. Where there were civilians, there would probably be loot, and where there was loot, there might be other boys already getting stuck in. But as he got closer, he realized that the screaming had a different quality to it. He rounded a corner and found himself in a small chamber, probably some kind of water filtration station judging by the pipes that ran along the walls and ceiling. In the center of the chamber was a group of about 24 human civilians huddled together in terror. And between the civilians and the chamber's entrance stood something that made even Grotzag, veteran of hundreds of battles, pause. It was an orc, but like nothing Grotzag had seen before. The creature was massive, even by orc standards, standing at least 9 feet tall with arms like tree trunks. Its skin was a deep, dark green, almost black, and covered in thick, warty growths that looked like they could turn aside a chainsword. It wore crude armor made from scavenged metal, and it carried what looked like a converted plasma weapon, clearly looted from some Imperial armory and modified to survive orc handling. But what made this orc truly terrifying was its state of mind. It was laughing, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed off the chamber walls. And as it laughed, it was slowly advancing on the cowering humans, it clearly savoring their fear, drawing out the moment before it attacked. This was not the quick, brutal violence of a normal orc fight. This was cruelty for its own sake. Sadism, given green-skinned form. Grotzag realized with a sinking feeling that this was a feral orc, one of the backwards tribes that occasionally sprouted on planets where orc spores had been left to grow without the guiding influence of proper orc culture. Feral orcs were dangerous because they were unpredictable, following old instincts without the tempering influence of clan structure and hierarchy. And this particular feral orc had clearly gone completely mad, more beast than thinking being. The proper orky thing to do would be to let the feral finish off the humies and then maybe fight it for dominance. Grotzag was pretty sure he could take it. He was smaller, but he was smarter, and smart usually beat big in a fight between orcs. But something about the situation bothered him. Maybe it was his time working for the rogue trader. Maybe it was some vestigial memory from the Blood Axe's long history of working with humies. But the idea of letting the feral slaughter defenseless civilians felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Before he could decide what to do, the situation was taken out of his hands. From another entrance to the chamber, a figure in dark green power armor emerged, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Grotzag recognized Space Marine armor immediately. He'd been shot at by enough of them to know that distinctive silhouette. But something was different about this one. Instead of the cold, methodical killing machine that Space Marines usually represented, this one seemed to radiate something else. Purpose, yes, but also something that might have been concern. The Space Marine took in the scene instantly. The civilians, the feral orc, and Grotzag himself standing in the entrance. For a long moment, everyone froze. The tableau crystallized in time. Then the feral orc turned toward the Space Marine, recognizing a worthy opponent, and charged with a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. Hephaestus had less than a second to assess the situation before the feral orc was upon him. His training took over, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to sidestep the plasma blast that the feral fired at point-blank range. The shot went wide, melting a hole in the wall behind him. Then the feral crashed into him like a freight train, its massive fists hammering against his power armor with enough force to crack ceramite. Hephaestus responded with his power hammer, activating its disruption field as he swung. The hammer connected with the feral's shoulder, and there was a flash of energy as the power field disrupted the creature's cellular structure. The feral staggered back, green blood, black in the dim lighting, spraying from the wound. But it didn't go down. Instead, it roared again and charged once more, clearly too frenzied to feel pain. From his vantage point at the other entrance, Grotzag watched the fight with professional interest. The Space Marine was good, no question about that. Fast, strong, and skilled enough to make every movement count. But the feral orc was a monster, and it had the advantage of pure, unreasoning rage. This was not a fight the Space Marine could win quickly, and in a prolonged battle, the feral's superior mass might tell. Grotzag made a decision that surprised even himself. He raised his shooter, a surprisingly well-maintained bolt pistol that he'd looted from a dead Space Marine years ago, and fired 3 shots in quick succession. All 3 hit the feral in the back, explosive rounds detonating inside its torso. The feral stumbled, turning to face this new threat, giving the Space Marine the opening he needed. Hephaeston's power hammer caught the feral under the chin, the blow delivered with such force that it lifted the massive orc off its feet. The feral crashed to the ground and did not get up again, its body twitching as its primitive nervous system slowly realized it was dead. The chamber fell silent, except for the sobbing of the civilians and the hum of power armor servos. Hephaeston turned to face the other orc, the one who had just helped him kill the feral, and for the first time in his 200 years of service, he found himself uncertain of what to do. Grotzag lowered his shooter, not holstering it, but pointing it at the floor in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. The Space Marine had his hammer raised, ready to continue the fight, but he wasn't attacking immediately. That was interesting. Most Space Marines wouldn't have hesitated, would have transitioned directly from one target to the next without thought. But this one was pausing, thinking, and that meant maybe he could be reasoned with. "You fought good," Grotzag said in heavily accented Gothic, at the words coming slowly as he tried to remember the proper pronunciation. "Dat git was mad. Would have killed the little humies." Hephaeston's armor speakers crackled to life. His voice filtered through the vocoder to a deep, resonant rumble. "You speak Gothic." It was not a question, but rather an observation laden with surprise. "Learned it," Grotzag replied. "Useful for dealing with humies. Sometime you can get more teeth by talking than by shooting." "You are Bloodaxe," Hephaeston said, his training allowing him to recognize the clan markings on Grotzag's armor. "Your clan has been known to work with Imperial forces on occasion." "Not working with you now," Grotzag pointed out. "But dat feral, he was wrong. Killing them humies, that wasn't a fight. Was just murder. Ain't no honor in dat, ain't no glory. Just a waste." The word choice was interesting. Honor, glory, waste. These were concepts that suggested a more complex understanding of conflict than Hephaeston would have attributed to an orc. His training told him that this was clearly a Xenos, and therefore an enemy that needed to be destroyed. But his compassion, that core quality that made him a salamander, recognized something in the orc's words. Recognition of the value of life, of the difference between combat and slaughter. Behind him, the civilians were watching in terrified fascination. To them, both the orc and the Space Marine were figures from nightmare, beings so far beyond their experience that they might as well have been watching God's debate. But they could sense that something unprecedented was happening, that these two warriors had not immediately turned on each other. Why did you help me?" Hephaeston asked, his hammer still ready but not quite pointing at Grotzag anymore. "Told you," Grotzag said, with what might have been a shrug. His massive shoulders moved in a way that suggested the gesture. "Wasn't right. And..." He paused, searching for the words in Gothic. "You're Space Marines. You fight good. Respect that. But you're also... You came here for the humies, yeah? To save 'em." "That is my duty," Hephaeston replied. "To protect humanity from threats like you." "Like me?" Grotzag made a sound that might have been laughter. "I'm just looking for scrap and a good fight. Wasn't planning on killing civvies. Most times they ain't even worth the effort. But that feral, he was different. Was gonna kill him just to kill him. That ain't orky. That's just mad." For a long moment, neither spoke. The chamber was filled with tension so thick it could have been cut with a chainsaw. Hephaeston's training warred with his compassion, his conditioning telling him that this was merely Xenos manipulation, that he should kill the orc now and complete his mission of protecting the civilians. But another part of him, the part that still remembered what it was like to be human, recognized something genuine in the orc's words. "The civilians need to be evacuated," Hephaeston said finally, making a decision that he knew would haunt him for years to come. "Can you guide me back to the surface? The tunnels here are a maze and my Auspex is having trouble mapping them." Grotzag's eyes, red in the dim lighting, widened slightly. This was unexpected. A Space Marine asking an orc for help. That went against everything he knew about Space Marines. While they were supposed to be proud, arrogant, certain of their own superiority, they didn't ask for help, especially not from Xenos. "You want me to help you?" Grotzag asked slowly, making sure he'd understood correctly. I want you to guide these people to safety, Hephaestus corrected. And then we go our separate ways. You return to your warband. I return to my brothers. What happens after that is in the hands of the Emperor and your gods. Gork and Mork, Grotzag supplied. Our gods. The brutal one and the cunning one. He paused, thinking. This was the strangest situation he'd ever been in, and that included the time he'd accidentally teleported into a Tau battlesuit factory. But there was something about the Space Marine's proposal that appealed to him. Maybe it was the recognition implied in it. The acknowledgement that Grotzag was capable of making choices rather than just following instinct. All right, Grotzag said finally. I'll get the little humies to the surface, but then we're even, yeah? You don't shoot me, I don't shoot you, and we both get on with our lives. Agreed, Hephaestus said, and he lowered his hammer for the first time since entering the chamber. What neither of them realized in that moment was that this simple agreement, born of pragmatism and unusual circumstances, would become the foundation for something unprecedented. A space marine and an orc, enemies by nature and doctrine, had chosen cooperation over conflict, and once that door was opened, even just a crack, it could never be fully closed again. Walking together. The journey to the surface took longer than either of them expected. Whilst the tunnels of the hive had been damaged by the orc assault, with several major routes collapsed or filled with debris, Grotzag led the way, his natural orc sense of direction, enhanced by the gestalt field that all orcs shared, allowing him to navigate the maze with surprising ease. Hephaestus followed, keeping himself between Grotzag and the civilians, his hammer ready but not activated, his flamer primed but not firing. The civilians, about 20 of them ranging from elderly men to young children, shuffled along in shocked silence. They could not comprehend what they were witnessing. A space marine, one of the Emperor's angels of death, walking peacefully alongside an orc. It went against everything they had been taught, everything they believed about the Imperium and its enemies. But they were too terrified and exhausted to question it. They simply followed, hoping that somehow, impossibly, they might survive this nightmare. As they walked, Hephaestus found himself observing the orc with the same curiosity he had always felt toward his enemies. Grotzag moved with a surprising economy of motion for something so massive. He wasn't the mindless brute that Imperial propaganda made orcs out to be. He checked corners carefully, tested unstable-looking passages before committing to them, and even helped one of the elderly civilians over a particularly difficult piece of debris. "You are not what I expected," Hephaestus said, breaking the silence. His voice echoed off the tunnel walls, filtered through his helmet speakers. Grotzag glanced back at the space marine. "What did you expect? Big, dumb brute who just wants to smash things." "Essentially, yes," Hephaestus admitted. "That is how the Codex Astartes describes your species. Single-minded, violent, and incapable of complex thought." "That book of yours," Grotzag said. "It wrong about a lot of things. We ain't dumb. Some orcs maybe. But the smart ones, we can be proper cunning when we need to be. And the blood axes, we learned from you humies. Learned that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to not get into it in the first place." "That is remarkably pragmatic for an orc," Hephaestus observed. "Ain't pragmatic," Grotzag corrected. "Is cunning. There's a difference. Pragmatic is just cold. Cunning is about finding the angle, you know? Seeing the way things could go that other gits don't see. Like right now, I could fight you, probably die, maybe take you with me. But that don't get me nothing except dead. Or I could help you get these humies out. Maybe you remember that later. Maybe it saves me from getting shot by other space marines. That's cunning." Hephaestus considered this. The orc was essentially describing what Imperial tacticians would call strategic thinking, the ability to see beyond immediate gains to longer-term benefits. It challenged the fundamental assumption that orcs were only capable of short-term planning focused on violence and loot. "Do all orcs think this way?" he asked. "Nah," Grotzag said. "Most boys, they just want to fight, and that's fine. We need the fighters. But every warband, they got some gits who think more. The mechs, they think about building things. The pain boys, they think about fixing things. And some of us, we think about what comes next, I guess." About more than just a fight we're in right now. They encountered more collapsed tunnels, and Grotzag had to backtrack several times to find alternative routes. During these delays, Hephaestion found himself watching how the orc interacted with the environment. Grotzag would test the stability of rubble with his foot before stepping on it, making sure it would hold his weight. He marked passages they'd already tried with crude symbols scratched into the walls. He even, at one point, stopped to listen carefully to the sounds of the hive around them, clearly trying to determine if there were other orcs nearby. "You are familiar with the layout of hive cities," Hephaestion observed. It was not a question. "Fought in a lot of them," Grotzag confirmed. "Humies love their hives. Big, complicated, lots of places to hide and lots of places to fight. You learn to navigate them after a while. This one ain't even that bad. I've been in hives where the whole thing was turning upside down while we fought in it." Necromunda, Hephaestion guessed. The hive world of Necromunda was infamous for its unstable hive structures and constant gang warfare. "Yeah, that was one of them," Grotzag said, sounding impressed. "You been there?" "Twice," Hephaestion replied. "Both times to purge orc infestations from the underhive. The terrain was challenging." "I bet," Grotzag said, with what might have been a laugh. "Necromunda's a right proper mess, but good fighting if you can find it. And the humies there, some of them got proper spirit, not like these poor gits." He gestured at the civilians behind them. "These ones, they're just scared." "They have every right to be scared," Hephaestion said. "Your species is invading their world. They have watched friends and family die. Fear is the appropriate response." "Maybe," Grotzag conceded. "But fear don't win fights. You gotta be brave to win. You gotta be willing to stand up even when you're scared. That's what makes a good fight, when both sides are willing to die for what they believe in." Hephaestion found himself surprised again by the orc's philosophy. This was not the mindless bloodlust that the Codex Astartes attributed to the greenskins. This was a warrior's code, crude perhaps, but no less genuine for its crudeness. Grotzag valued courage, valued opponents who would fight with determination rather than break and run. In a strange way, it was not that different from the values that the Space Marines espoused. They reached a junction where 3 tunnels met, and Grotzag paused to consider which direction to take. While he thought, Hephaestion's Vox crackled to life. His squad was trying to reach him, the signal finally strong enough to penetrate the interference of the hive's infrastructure. "Brother Sergeant Hephaestion, what is your status?" The voice belonged to Brother Piriel, the squad's flamer specialist. "We lost your signal after the tunnel collapse. Are you wounded?" "I am unharmed, Brother Piriel," Hephaestion replied. "I have located a group of civilians and am escorting them to the surface." There was a pause on the other end. "Acknowledged. Transmit your coordinates and we will provide support." Hephaestion hesitated. If his squad arrived, they would immediately engage Grotzag. There would be no negotiation, no attempts at communication. They would see an orc and respond as they had been trained to respond, with overwhelming force. And Grotzag, despite his cooperation, would be forced to either fight or flee. The civilians might be caught in the crossfire. "Negative," Hephaestion said, making another decision that went against his training. "The tunnels are unstable. Additional weight might cause further collapses. I will reach the surface on my own and rendezvous with you there." There was a longer pause this time. Brother Piriel was no fool, and he could likely sense that something was unusual about the situation. But the chain of command held. Hephaestion was a sergeant, and Piriel was merely a battle brother. "Acknowledged, Brother Sergeant. We await your return. The Emperor protects." "The Emperor protects," Hephaestion replied automatically, and severed the Vox connection. Grotzag had been listening with obvious interest. "Your boys want to come help you," he observed. "But you told them no. Why?" "Because if they come, they will try to kill you," Hephaestion said bluntly. "And you would be forced to defend yourself, and these civilians would likely die in the fighting." "So you lied to your own warriors to protect me?" Grotzag sounded genuinely puzzled by this. "That don't make sense." I'm the enemy. I'm what you're supposed to be fighting against. You are, Hephaestus agreed. But you have chosen not to fight right now. You are helping me protect these civilians. To repay that assistance with violence would be dishonorable. The word hung in the air between them. Honor. It was a concept that Hephaestus had been taught applied only to fellow servants of the emperor, heir to those who fought for humanity's survival. Xenos were incapable of honor by definition, because honor required a moral framework that aliens simply did not possess. And yet, here was an orc who had demonstrated honor through his actions, who had chosen protection over violence, who had put himself at risk to help civilians who were, by all rights, his enemies. Huh, Grotzag said finally. So you got honor, even for orcs. That's interesting. Most humies, they just see us as things to be killed. But you see us as, what, warriors? I see you as an individual, Hephaestus said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke. I have been taught that all Xenos are the same, that they are a monolithic threat that must be destroyed. But you are clearly capable of making choices, of having preferences, and of valuing things beyond simple violence. That suggests an interior life, a sense of self. And if you have a sense of self, then you are not merely a target, you are a being. This was heresy, Hephaestus knew. This line of thinking went against everything he had been taught, everything that had been burned into his mind through years of hypno-indoctrination. To acknowledge a Xenos as a being with its own agency, its own values, was to question the fundamental doctrine of the Imperium that held that only humanity deserved to survive and prosper in the galaxy. But Hephaestus could not deny what his own eyes had shown him. Grotzag was not a mindless monster. He was a thinking being, capable of reason and perhaps even compassion in his own limited way. And that recognition, once made, could not be unmade. Grotzag was silent for a long time, Mar clearly struggling with his own thoughts. Finally, he said, "You know, for a Humie, you ain't so bad. Most space marines, they don't even talk to us. They just shoot. But you actually listen. That's rare." "Perhaps it should not be," Hephaestus replied. They resumed their journey, and something had shifted between them. It was not friendship, not yet. They were still enemies by doctrine and nature, still on opposite sides of a conflict that had raged across the galaxy for millennia. But there was recognition now, a mutual acknowledgement that they were more than just targets to each other, that they were individuals capable of making choices that went beyond simple violence. The path to the surface eventually opened up, and they emerged into the ash-grey morning of Sigma Tertius 7. The civilians, realizing they had actually survived, began to weep with relief. Some fell to their knees, offering prayers to the Emperor. Others simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process what had happened. Hephaestus activated his Vox and transmitted his coordinates to his squad. They would arrive within minutes, and when they did, the temporary truce between him and Grotzag would end. They both knew this. It was inevitable. "You gonna tell your warriors about me?" Grotzag asked. Hephaestus considered the question. If he reported that an orc had helped him rescue civilians, there would be questions. His superiors would want to know why he had not simply killed the orc on sight. They might question his loyalty, his dedication to the Emperor's will, and even if they believed his account, they would simply see it as Xeno's manipulation, as a cunning trick that Grotzag had used to survive, rather than a genuine act of assistance. "I will tell them that I encountered and eliminated a feral orc that was threatening civilians," Hephaestus said slowly, "and that I successfully evacuated the survivors to the surface. That is all they need to know." "So you're gonna lie," Grotzag said. "Fair me, fair an orc." "I am being selective with the truth," Hephaestus corrected. "There is a difference." Grotzag laughed, a deep rumbling sound that shook his massive frame. "You know what? I like you, Humie. You got something that most space marines don't got. You got," he searched for the right word, "you got heart. That's rare. Rare for Humies, rare for orcs. Most of us, We just want to fight and die fighting. But you actually care about stuff. About people. Even about an orc you just met. I do not care about you, Hephaestus said, but there was less certainty in his voice than there should have been. You are still a Xenos, still an enemy of humanity. Sure, Grotzag said, waving a massive hand dismissively. Whatever you need to tell yourself, but you let me live when you could have killed me. That counts for something. In the distance, Hephaestus could hear the roar of jump packs. His squad was approaching rapidly. He turned to Grotzag, his hammer held at his side rather than raised to strike. You should go, now, before they arrive. Grotzag nodded. Yeah, probably should. But Hume, Salamander, if we meet again, maybe we don't shoot right away, yeah? Maybe we talk first, see if we got a fight or if we can do something else. If we meet again, Hephaestus said carefully. I will not shoot first, but I cannot promise anything beyond that. My duty to the Emperor must come before any personal considerations. That's all I can ask, Grotzag said. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. You ever get tired of fighting? Of always being at war? The question caught Hephaestus off guard. It was not something he had ever allowed himself to consider. Space Marines did not get tired. They did not question. They fought because that was what they were made to do, and they continued fighting until they died in service to the Emperor. But beneath the conditioning, beneath the layers of indoctrination and enhancement, there was still a spark of something human in Hephaestus. And that spark whispered that yes, sometimes he did get tired. Tired of the endless violence, tired of seeing worlds burn, tired of adding to the mountain of corpses that the Imperium built in its desperate struggle for survival. Sometimes, he admitted quietly, but my duty is not determined by my feelings. I serve because humanity needs warriors, and so I fight. Maybe someday, Grotzag said, we'll live in a galaxy where we don't gotta fight all the time, where we can just be. Before Hephaestus could respond, Grotzag was gone, disappearing into the ruins of a mining facility with surprising speed for something so large. Moments later, the rest of Hephaestus' squad arrived, drop packs firing retros as they descended from the sky. Brother Sergeant, Imperium said, his helmet's eye lenses glowing in the grey morning light. We are relieved to find you unharmed. The civilians? Safe, Hephaestus replied. All of them. We have encountered minimal resistance en route to the surface. It was not a complete lie. He had encountered minimal resistance from orcs who wanted to fight him. Everything else was just selective omission of details that his brothers did not need to know. As the squad prepared to move out, Hephaestus found himself looking back at the ruins where Grotzag had disappeared. Something had changed in him during that brief encounter. Something he did not fully understand and was not sure he wanted to examine too closely. For the first time in his 2 centuries of service, he had met an enemy and found in that enemy something worth preserving rather than destroying. It was a dangerous thought, one that could lead down paths that ended in heresy and damnation. And yet, Hephaestus could not bring himself to regret it. In the darkness of the Imperium, where compassion was often seen as weakness and mercy was heresy, he had found a moment of genuine connection with someone who should have been nothing more than a target. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that if he and Grotzag met again, things would never be quite as simple as doctrine demanded they should be. Separate paths, shared thoughts. In the weeks following the evacuation of Sigma Tertius 7, both Hephaestus and Grotzag found themselves thinking about their encounter more than they wanted to admit. For both, the experience had created cracks in worldviews that had previously seemed unassailable. Hephaestus returned to the Eternal Flame and resumed his duties as if nothing had happened. He participated in the systematic cleansing of the orc infestation on Sigma Tertius 7, his bolter claiming dozens of greenskin lives as the salamanders pushed the invaders back to their landing site and eventually drove them off the planet entirely. He performed each kill with the same efficiency and precision he had demonstrated for 2 centuries, and to any external observer, nothing about him had changed. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. When he aimed at an orc now, for just a fraction of a second, he found himself wondering if this particular greenskin was capable of thought, of choice, of being something more than a target. The hesitation was infinitesimal, never enough to affect his performance in combat, but it was there, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. During the mandatory prayer sessions, when his squad gathered in the chapel to offer devotions to the Emperor, Hephaestus found his thoughts wandering. The familiar litanies about humanity's righteousness and the necessity of purging the Xenos threat felt hollow in ways they never had before. He still believed in the Emperor, still believed in humanity's right to survive and prosper. But he could no longer believe with absolute certainty that Xenos were incapable of anything resembling virtue. Brother Chaplain Adrax, who led the devotions, must have sensed something was wrong. Chaplains were trained to watch for signs of wavering faith, for the subtle indicators that a battle brother was struggling with doubt. After one particularly lengthy prayer session, Adrax approached Hephaestus privately. "Brother Sergeant," the chaplain said, his skull-faced helmet giving his words an ominous weight. "You have been unusually quiet since our deployment to Sigma Tertius 7. Is something troubling you?" Hephaestus considered his response carefully. Chaplains were not merely spiritual advisors. They were also the enforcers of mental discipline, responsible for identifying and purging any thoughts that might lead to heresy. If he admitted to having doubts about the Imperium's xenocidal policies, Adrax would be required to report him to the chapter leadership. At best, he would face mandatory reconsecration and additional hypno-indoctrination to reinforce his conditioning. At worst, he could be judged compromised and executed as a potential threat to the chapter's purity. "I am merely contemplating the nature of our enemies," Hephaestus said carefully. Trying to better understand their tactics and motivations so that I might fight them more effectively." It was not quite a lie, but it was not the full truth either. Adrax studied him for a long moment, and Hephaestus wondered if the chaplain could somehow sense the deception. But finally, Adrax nodded slowly. "Understanding the enemy is vital," the chaplain said. "But remember, Brother Sergeant, that understanding must never become sympathy. The Xenos are our enemies, not because they have wronged us personally, but because their very existence is a threat to humanity's survival. We cannot afford mercy, cannot afford compassion for those who would see our species destroyed." "I understand, Brother Chaplain," Hephaestus replied. And he did. He understood the doctrine perfectly. What troubled him was that he was no longer certain the doctrine was entirely correct. Grotzag's experience after leaving Sigma Tertius 7 was, in its own way, equally difficult. He returned to his warband to find that the assault had been called off. The arrival of the Space Marines had convinced Grotzag's boss, a massive goth named Grimtooth, that the planet was more trouble than it was worth. Better to find easier targets, planets without the Emperor's angels defending them. The warband packed up their loot and departed, leaving Sigma Tertius 7 scarred, but intact. During the voyage to their next target, Grotzag found himself in an unusual state of introspection. Orcs were not, generally speaking, given to deep thought about philosophical matters. They lived in the moment, focused on the immediate concerns of fighting, eating, and asserting dominance within their social hierarchy. But Grotzag had always been different, even among the Blood Axes, and his encounter with Hephaestus had crystallized thoughts that had been forming in his mind for years. He found himself in the ship's common area, a massive chamber filled with orcs drinking fungus beer and arm wrestling to determine pecking order. One of his squad mates, a knob named Scragger, approached him with a suspicious look. "You've been acting weird, Grotzag," Scragger said bluntly. Orcs were not subtle in their communication. "Ever since we pulled out from that Humi world, something happened down there?" "Fought some gits," Grotzag said with a shrug. "Killed some Humies, regular stuff." "Yeah, but you ain't been fighting much since we got back," Scragger observed. "Usually you're all about proving your toughness, and now you're just sitting around thinking. Thinking ain't natural for orcs." "Thinking is what makes Blood Axes different," Grotzag replied. "We think about stuff. about tactics and strategy and how to win fights without just charging straight in. That's different from what you've been doing, Scragga insisted. You've been thinking about philosophical stuff. I heard you mumbling about honor and enemies and whether fighting is always the right answer. That's weird, Grotzag. That's almost un-orky. The accusation stung more than Grotzag wanted to admit. In Orc society, being called un-orky was a serious insult. It suggested weakness, a failure to live up to the ideals of Orc culture. But Grotzag could not deny that Scragga had a point. His thoughts had been trending in directions that most Orcs would never consider. I met a Humie, Grotzag admitted finally. A space marine. He was different from der others. He talked to me like I was a person, not just a target. Scragga's expression went from suspicious to shocked. You talked with a space marine. Dem gits don't talk. They just shoot. This one did, Grotzag said. And he made me think about things. About whether we always got to be fighting. About whether there might be other ways to live. Other ways to live? Scragga repeated, his voice rising in alarm. Grotzag, you sound like you're being corrupted by something. Maybe dem Humies got some kind of mind control. You should go see the weird boy. Get your brain checked. Me brain is fine, Grotzag insisted. I'm just questioning things. Is that so wrong? For an Orc? Yeah, kinda, Scragga said bluntly. We fight because we're Orcs. That's what we do. Oh, we don't need to question it. We just need to do it good. The conversation bothered Grotzag for days afterward. Was Scragga right? Was there something wrong with him for questioning the fundamental nature of Orc existence? Or was it possible that questioning things, examining beliefs rather than simply accepting them, was actually a strength rather than a weakness? He found himself thinking about Hephaestus more than he wanted to admit. The Space Marine had shown him something he had never seen before in a Humie: genuine respect. Not the kind of grudging acknowledgement that the Blood Axes sometimes received when they worked as mercenaries, but actual, honest recognition of Grotzag as a thinking being with his own agency. And that recognition had awakened something in Grotzag that he could not easily suppress. He began to wonder if the endless cycle of violence that defined Orc existence was really the only way they could live. The idea was almost heretical by Orc standards. Fighting was what Orcs did. It was their purpose, their reason for being, the foundation of their entire society. To question that was to question everything that made them Orcs. And yet, Grotzag could not shake the feeling that there might be more to life than just fighting and dying. He had seen in his brief encounter with Hephaestus a glimpse of a different kind of relationship between enemies, one based on mutual respect rather than pure hatred, on recognition of shared values rather than focus on differences. It was a dangerous line of thinking, and Grotzag knew it. If word got out that he was questioning the fundamental nature of Orc society, and other Orcs would view him as a threat, they might challenge him to prove his Orciness through combat, or worse, simply kill him in his sleep as a corrupting influence. The Orc Gestalt field had a way of enforcing conformity, of making Orcs who strayed too far from the norm uncomfortable or even ill. But Grotzag could not stop thinking, and he could not stop wondering if, somewhere in the vast galaxy, a space marine named Hephaestus was thinking similar thoughts. The second meeting. Fate, or perhaps the galaxy's sense of irony, brought them together again sooner than either expected. 6 months after Sigma Tertius 7, Hephaestus's company was deployed to a world called Karlek Prime to deal with an Orc infestation. The planet was a strategic waypoint along a major shipping lane, and the Mechanicus had significant mining operations there. The Orcs had arrived in force, clearly planning to establish a permanent presence. The campaign was expected to be straightforward: drop in, eliminate the Orc leadership, scatter the remaining mobs, and move on. Standard procedure for the Salamanders, something they had done hundreds of times before. But when Hephaestus's squad deployed to investigate reports of Orc activity near one of the mining facilities, they found something unexpected. The facility had been fortified, not in the crude, haphazard way that Orcs usually fortified positions, but with actual thought given to defensive tactics. The walls had been reinforced at their weak points. The approaches were covered by overlapping fields of fire. There were even what looked like prepared fallback positions if the main defenses were breached. And this level of tactical sophistication was unusual for orcs, and it immediately suggested Bloodaxe involvement. Hephaeston's squad approached carefully, using the rugged terrain around the facility for cover. They were spotted when they were still several hundred meters out, and the orcs opened fire with surprising discipline. Rather than simply spraying bullets in the general direction of the enemy, the orc shooters were taking aimed shots, trying to hit specific targets rather than relying on volume of fire. "Brother Sergeant!" Piriel voxed, his voice tight with the excitement of combat. "The Xenos are showing unusual tactical awareness. Request permission to advance and engage at close range where our armor advantage will be most effective." "Negative," Hephaeston responded. "Hold position and observe. This is not typical orc behavior. I want to understand what we are dealing with before we commit to an assault." As they watched, a figure emerged from the facility. Even at this distance, Hephaeston recognized the massive frame, the distinctive Bloodaxe clan markings on the armor. It was Grotzag. The orc warlord stood on the facility's wall, clearly visible to the salamanders, and raised something that looked like a white flag, an old human custom adopted by the Bloodaxes during their long association with Imperial forces. "Is that Xenos surrendering?" asked Brother Drusus, the squad's newest member and the one with the least experience fighting orcs. "Bloodaxes don't surrender," Hephaeston said, more to himself than to his squad. "They're proposing parley." "Parley with Xenos?" Piriel sounded appalled. "Brother Sergeant, surely you cannot be considering this." "I am considering getting information about enemy disposition and intentions," Hephaeston replied. "Knowledge is a weapon, Brother Piriel. Perhaps the Xenos commander wants to negotiate terms of retreat. If we can drive them off this world without a costly assault, we should at least hear what they have to say." It was a thin rationalization, and Hephaeston knew it. The real reason he wanted to approach was because he recognized Grotzag, and some part of him was curious to see if their previous encounter had been an aberration or the beginning of something more significant. But he could not tell his squad that, could not admit that he felt anything other than contempt for the Xenos commander. "I will approach alone," Hephaeston said, standing from cover. "Maintain position and cover me. If this is a trap, eliminate all Xenos targets with extreme prejudice." "Brother Sergeant, this is highly irregular," Piriel protested. "Chapter protocol does not." "Chapter protocol gives squad leaders discretion in tactical matters," Hephaeston interrupted. "I am exercising that discretion. Maintain your position, brother." He walked toward the facility, his hammer held loosely at his side, in what he hoped was a non-threatening posture. As he approached, Grotzag descended from the wall and walked out to meet him, stopping about 10 meters away. They stood there for a moment, two warriors who should have been trying to kill each other, simply regarding one another. "Humi," Grotzag said, finally, his accent as thick as ever, but his Gothic more practiced than it had been 6 months ago. "Salamander. I thought that might be you when I heard Space Marines were coming. Figured we should talk before things get messy." "Grotzag," Hephaeston acknowledged. "You have fortified this facility with considerable tactical sophistication. This is not typical orc behavior." "Been learning," Grotzag said with what might have been pride. "Been thinking about our last talk, about how you saw me as more than just a target. Made me wonder if maybe I could do more than just fight." "You are still an enemy of the Imperium," Hephaeston pointed out. "Your presence here threatens Imperial interests. I have orders to eliminate all Xenos on this world." "Yeah, I know," Grotzag said. "And I got orders from me boss to hold this facility. So we got a problem, you and me. We could fight. Probably lots of gits would die on both sides. Or..." He paused, clearly uncertain how to phrase what he wanted to say. "Or maybe we could find another way." "What other way could there be?" Hephaeston asked, genuinely curious despite himself. "You want this facility. The Imperium needs this facility. Our objectives are mutually exclusive." Maybe, Grotzag said, but maybe not. What if we shared it? The suggestion was so unexpected that Hephaestus actually paused. Share a facility with Xenos? The idea was absurd. It went against every principle of the Imperium, every tenet of imperial doctrine. And yet, as he thought about it, he found himself wondering if it might actually be practical. Explain, he said simply. Da Mechanicus gits, they want the ore from the mines, yeah? Grotzag said. Well, we don't care about the ore. We care about the scrap metal from the facility itself. Up the machines and equipment. What if we worked out a deal? You let us strip the old equipment. We let your tech priests keep the mine operating. No fight, no deaths. Everybody gets something. It was, Hephaestus had to admit, not a terrible idea from a purely practical standpoint. The facility's equipment was old and would need to be replaced anyway. If the orcs stripped it for scrap, the Mechanicus could install newer, more efficient machinery while the mines continued to operate. The cost in equipment would be far less than the cost in lives and material that a full-scale assault would require. But it was still cooperation with Xenos, and that was heresy of the highest order. The Imperium did not negotiate with aliens. It did not make deals or compromises. It simply destroyed anything that stood in the way of humanity's survival. My superiors would never approve such an arrangement, Hephaestus said finally. To even suggest it would be to question the fundamental doctrines of the Imperium. Then don't suggest it, Grotzag said. Tell them we offered to withdraw if you gave us some worthless scrap as a trophy. Make it sound like we're idiots who don't know the value of things. Then we both get what we want without fighting. You are asking me to lie to my chapter, Hephaestus said. I'm asking you to be smart, Grotzag corrected. Sometimes the best victory is the one where nobody dies. That's what your blood axes learned from you Humies, yeah? That sometimes cunning beats strength. Hephaestus thought about what Grotzag was proposing. If he could pull this off, he could secure the facility with minimal casualties and allow the mining operations to resume quickly. The Mechanicus would be pleased at the rapid resolution. His chapter would gain another victory to add to their record. And all it would cost was some old equipment that needed to be replaced anyway. The fact that it would also require him to deceive his superiors and hide the fact that he had negotiated with Xenos was troubling. But was it more troubling than the alternative? If he refused Grotzag's offer, they would fight. His squad would likely win, but they might take casualties. Definitely some orcs would die, but more than that, the opportunity for something unprecedented would be lost. Two enemies had found a way to resolve their conflict without violence. That should not be possible in the 41st millennium. And yet, here it was, being offered as a genuine alternative to war. I need guarantees, Hephaestus said slowly, hardly believing he was even considering this. If I agree to this arrangement, I need your word that your forces will leave this planet once you have stripped the facility. No attacks on other Imperial holdings, no raids on convoys. You take your scrap and depart immediately. You got it, Grotzag said immediately. Me word as a blood axe war boss. We'll strip what we came for and then we're gone. And more than that, if you ever need help, if you ever find yourself in a situation where maybe some orc muscle could be useful, you call for me. I'll come. I will never request assistance from Xenos, Hephaestus said firmly. Maybe not, Grotzag conceded, but the offer's there anyway, just in case. They stood in silence for a moment, two warriors from enemy species who had found something approaching mutual respect. Hephaestus knew that what he was about to do could be considered treason. If the truth ever came out, he would be judged and executed. But he also knew that this was right in a way that simple violence could never be. 3 days, Hephaestus said finally. You have 3 days to strip the facility and leave orbit. After that, if any orc signature remains in this system, we will hunt you down and destroy you utterly. 3 days is plenty, Grotzag said. We'll be gone in 2. And Humi, Salamander, thank you for trusting me, for seeing me as more than just a monster to be killed. That means something. You are still a Xenos, Hephaestus said, but there was less conviction in his voice than there should have been. Still an enemy of humanity. This does not change that. Maybe not, Grotzak said, but maybe it changes us. Oh, both of us. Hephaestus returned to his squad, his mind already formulating the report he would give to his superiors. He would tell them that he had scouted the facility and determined that the orcs were already in the process of withdrawing, clearly spooked by the Space Marine presence, that they had stripped some worthless old equipment and fled the planet like the cowards they were. It was a lie that played into Imperial prejudices about orc stupidity and cowardice, and it would be believed without question. And in 2 days, when the orcs departed as promised, that lie would be reinforced. The facility would be secured with minimal effort. The mining operations would resume, and no one would ever know that a Space Marine and an orc had found a way to resolve their conflict through negotiation rather than violence. But Hephaestus would know, and Grotzak would know, and that knowledge would change both of them in ways neither could fully predict. The weight of secrets. The following months were difficult for both warriors, though for different reasons. Hephaestus found himself bearing the weight of his deception like a physical burden. Every time he participated in prayer services, every time he chanted the litanies of hate against the Xenos, he felt like a hypocrite. He had not just failed to kill an enemy of humanity, he had actively cooperated with that enemy, had made agreements and kept them, had treated a Xenos as if it were a being worthy of trust and respect. The worst part was that he could not fully regret what he had done. The arrangement on Karlak Prime had worked exactly as planned. But the orcs had stripped the facility of obsolete equipment and departed within 48 hours, just as Grotzak had promised. The Mechanicus tech priests had been able to install newer, more efficient machinery without having to fight through orc defenses. Productivity at the mine had actually increased compared to pre-invasion levels. By any objective measure, Hephaestus's decision had been the correct one. But it had also been heresy, and heresy did not become acceptable just because it produced positive results. The Imperium was not a pragmatic institution that evaluated actions based on their outcomes. It was a dogmatic one that evaluated actions based on their adherence to doctrine. And the doctrine was clear. Xenos were to be destroyed, not negotiated with. There were no exceptions, and no special circumstances that made cooperation acceptable. Brother Chaplain Adrax seemed to sense that something was troubling Hephaestus, though the chaplain could not put his finger on exactly what. He began spending more time with Hephaestus, leading him in additional prayer sessions, assigning him extra penance duties. It was clear that Adrax suspected some form of spiritual corruption, though he had no evidence of any specific wrongdoing. "Brother Sergeant," Adrax said one day during a private conversation, "I have noticed a certain hesitancy in your recent engagements with Xenos forces. You complete your objectives efficiently, but there is a delay, a moment of consideration before you act. This concerns me." "I am simply being more tactical in my approach," Hephaestus replied, which was not entirely untrue. Considering the best way to eliminate the enemy rather than simply attacking on instinct. "The Codex Astartes provides guidance on tactical doctrine," Adrax pointed out. "It does not require hesitation or contemplation in the face of the Xenos threat. The enemy must be destroyed swiftly and without mercy. Anything less is a failure of duty." "I understand, Brother Chaplain," Hephaestus said. "I will endeavor to be more decisive in future engagements." But even as he made this promise, Hephaestus knew it was one he could not keep. The hesitation Adrax had noticed was not tactical consideration. It was doubt, pure and simple. Doubt about whether every Xenos truly deserved to die, whether there might not be some among the alien species who were capable of reason, of honor, and of being something more than mindless threats to humanity's existence. And this doubt was made worse by the knowledge that he was, in a sense, right. He had proven through his encounters with Grotzak that at least one Xenos was capable of all those things. The Orc warlord had kept his word, had demonstrated honor, had shown that cooperation was possible. And if one Xenos could do this, might there not be others? It was a dangerous line of thinking, one that could lead to questioning the very foundations of Imperial doctrine. And Hephaestus knew that if he followed this path too far, it would end in either his own corruption and fall to heresy, or his execution by his own chapter for the crime of showing sympathy to the Xenos. Grotzag's experience was different but equally challenging in its own way. As where Hephaestus struggled with doubt and deception, Grotzag found himself dealing with the consequences of demonstrating an un-Orky approach to warfare. Word had spread through his warband about the negotiation on Karlak Prime, about how Grotzag had talked with the Space Marines and arranged a peaceful withdrawal rather than fighting to the bitter end. Most of the orcs in the warband didn't understand it. Fighting was what orcs did. It was their purpose, their joy, the thing that made life worth living. To pass up a fight, especially a fight against Space Marines who were among the most respected of all enemies, seemed like weakness. And weakness, in orc society, was not tolerated for long. Grotzag found himself challenged to combat more frequently than before. Other orcs, sensing that his position might be weakening, each saw an opportunity to raise their own status by defeating him. He won each challenge, his size and experience making him more than a match for any individual challenger. But each fight was a reminder that his way of thinking, his willingness to negotiate rather than simply smash, was not widely accepted among his own kind. Skragga, his old squad mate, approached him after one particularly brutal challenge match. "Grotzag," Skragga said quietly, "you gotta stop this philosophical stuff. You gotta be more orky, or someone's gonna challenge you who can actually beat you, and then you'll be dead." "Maybe being orky ain't the only way," Grotzag replied, nursing a bruised arm where his last challenger had managed to land a solid hit. "Maybe we could be something more." "More than orcs?" Skragga sounded horrified. "Grotzag, listen to yourself. You're sounding like one of them chaos gits, talking about transcending and becoming something else. That's dangerous. That's how you get dead, or worse, that's how you get corrupted." "I don't want to be corrupted," Grotzag said tiredly. "I just want to live in a galaxy where we don't gotta fight all the time, where maybe we could build stuff instead of just smashing it." "That ain't the orc way," Skragga insisted. "And if you keep pushing for it, the other boys are gonna put you down. Not 'cause they hate you, but 'cause you're threatening the whole system. The Gestalt field, it enforces conformity. You go too far from the norm, and it'll make you sick. It might even kill you." Grotzag knew Skragga was right. He had heard stories of orcs who strayed too far from the norm, who started thinking in ways that were too alien to the orc psyche. The Gestalt field, as that collective unconscious that bound all orcs together, rejected them. They became weak, sickly, eventually dying as their connection to the greater orc consciousness withered away. But Grotzag could not stop thinking about the alternative. He had seen it in Hephaestus, in the way the Space Marine had been willing to consider options beyond simple violence. If a Humi, a member of a species that literally bred warriors to fight and die for their cause, could recognize that there were alternatives to endless war, then surely orcs could too. The problem was convincing other orcs of this, and that, Grotzag was beginning to realize, might be impossible. The orc species was too fundamentally built around violence. Their biology, their psychology, their very purpose for existing, all of it pointed toward conflict as the natural state of being. It had to change that would require changing the fundamental nature of what it meant to be an orc. And maybe, Grotzag thought to himself in his rare moments of introspection, that was too high a price to pay. The third time. It took nearly a year before their paths crossed again, and when they did, it was under circumstances neither had anticipated. A distress signal had been detected coming from a derelict space hulk drifting through the Hadrian sector. Space hulks were dangerous things, massive conglomerations of ships that had been fused together in the warp, often carrying all manner of horrors within their twisted corridors. But they also sometimes contained valuable archaeotech, or gene seed, from lost Space Marine chapters, making them worth investigating despite the risks. Hephaestus's company had been dispatched to investigate the hulk, had to determine if it contained anything of value, and to purge any threats they might find. They boarded the hulk, using Thunderhawk gunships, cutting through the hull with melter charges to gain entry into the nightmare of twisted metal that made up the Space Hulk's structure. What they found was unexpected. The Hulk had already been boarded, and the boarding party had been orcs. Blood axes, based on the clan markings visible on the bodies scattered throughout the corridors. But these orcs had clearly encountered something that had overwhelmed them. The bodies showed signs of combat, but the wounds were strange, not matching any weapon system Hephaestus recognized. Following the trail of dead orcs deeper into the Hulk, Hephaestus's squad eventually heard the sounds of combat ahead. They moved carefully toward the source, weapons ready, expecting to encounter whatever had killed the orcs. What they found instead was a nightmare scene. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that had once been a ship's cargo hold. In the center of the chamber was Grotzag, his armor damaged, green blood leaking from multiple wounds. Around him stood a dozen orcs, the last survivors of his boarding party, and attacking them from all sides was something that made even the Space Marines pause. Genestealers, dozens of them, their purple carapaces gleaming in the flickering emergency lighting of the Hulk. The Tyrannid vanguard organisms were among the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy, capable of moving with inhuman speed and tearing through armor with their rending claws. A single Genestealer was a serious threat. Dozens of them were a death sentence. The orcs were fighting desperately, but it was clear they were losing. Genestealers darted in and out of their defensive circle, claws flashing, dragging away orcs who strayed too far from their companions. Grotzag stood in the center, his looted plasma weapon firing in controlled bursts, trying to maintain some semblance of order among his panicking warriors. Xenos, Brother Piriel observed unnecessarily. Multiple species. Recommend we withdraw and call for an orbital bombardment to destroy the Hulk entirely. It was the tactically sound decision. The orcs and the Genestealers would kill each other, solving two problems simultaneously. There was no logical reason to intervene, no strategic value in saving a group of Xenos from another group of Xenos. They should simply leave, seal the Hulk, and let nature take its course. No, Hephaestus said, surprising even himself. We engage. Priority targets are the Genestealers. The orcs are secondary. Brother Sergeant, Piriel protested, we cannot possibly be assisting Xenos against other Xenos. This violates every... The Genestealers are a Tyrannid vanguard, Hephaestus interrupted, his voice firm. Their presence indicates a hive fleet may be en route to this sector. We cannot allow them to establish a foothold. We engage immediately. That is an order, brother. It was a thin rationalization, but it was technically within the bounds of Imperial doctrine. Tyrannids were considered the greatest threat to the galaxy, worse even than chaos. Any encounter with Tyrannid organisms was to be met with maximum force and immediate response. If Hephaestus happened to save some orcs in the process of purging the Genestealers, well, now that was merely an unfortunate side effect of completing his primary objective. The salamanders opened fire, their bolters finding targets with the precision that came from centuries of training. Genestealers exploded under the impact of mass reactive rounds, their carapaces no protection against weapons designed to penetrate power armor. The few that tried to engage the Space Marines directly found themselves outmatched, their rending claws scoring the ceramite of power armor, but unable to penetrate it. Grotzag recognized the distinctive armor pattern of salamanders immediately, and for just a moment, his tactical mind wondered if they were about to be caught between two groups of enemies. But then he saw the pattern of their fire, saw that they were targeting only the Genestealers, while carefully avoiding shots that might hit the orcs. The Space Marines were helping them, actually helping them. Boys, Grotzag bellowed over the sounds of combat. Rally on the Space Marines. We're working together now, like it or not. The orcs, to their credit, responded immediately. They might not have understood why the Space Marines were helping them, but they were smart enough to take advantage of it. They formed up in a defensive line alongside the salamanders, their own crude weapons adding to the volume of fire being directed at the Genestealers. The battle was brutal and short. The Genestealers, caught between two groups of enemies and deprived of their advantage of surprise, were methodically eliminated. The last one fell to a combined strike from Hephaestan's power hammer and Grotzag's plasma weapon, both warriors acting in perfect coordination, despite having never trained together. When the last Genestealer body hit the floor, there was a moment of absolute silence. The Orcs and the Space Marines stared at each other across the gore-stained deck, weapons still raised, neither side certain what should happen next. Finally, Grotzag lowered his plasma weapon and addressed Hephaestan directly. "Salamander," the Orc said, his Gothic better than it had been during their last meeting. "Thank you. You didn't have to help us. Could have just let us die and then dealt with the Stealers yourself." "The Tyranids are a threat to all life in the galaxy," Hephaestan replied, adhering to his prepared rationalization. "Your deaths would not have prevented their spread. Better to combine forces against a common enemy." Right, Grotzag said. And there was something in his tone that suggested he understood that this was not the complete truth. "Common enemy. Makes sense." Behind their respective leaders, both groups of warriors watched with varying degrees of confusion and suspicion. The Orcs could not quite believe that Space Marines had helped them. The Space Marines could not quite believe that their sergeant had ordered them to save Xenos lives. But both groups had been trained to follow orders without question, and so they held their fire and waited to see what would happen next. "We need to get off this hulk," Grotzag said. "Our ship is docked on the other side, but the route we took coming in is blocked now. All them Stealers probably came from that direction." "Our Thunderhawks are closer," Hephaestan said, at making another decision that went against everything he had been taught. "We can transport you to your ship, but first, we need to purge this hulk. If there are Genestealer eggs here, they need to be destroyed before they can spread." "Agreed," Grotzag said immediately. "Tyranids are bad news for everybody. We'll help you sweep the hulk. Make sure all the bugs are dead, then we can go our separate ways." And so, in one of the strangest moments in the history of both species, a squad of salamanders and a mob of Bloodaxe Orcs worked together to systematically clear a space hulk of Genestealer infestation. They moved through the twisted corridors in a loose formation, the Orcs taking point with their higher numbers, the Space Marines providing supporting fire with their superior marksmanship. They found 3 more nests of Genestealers, each one purged with flame and bolt. They discovered a clutch of Genestealer eggs, pulsing with obscene life, which Hephaestan personally destroyed with his flamer, while the Orcs provided cover. They even found a few surviving Imperial Guard personnel who had been part of the Hulk's original crew, huddled in a sealed compartment and nearly mad with terror. The Orcs, to Hephaestan's surprise, did not kill the guardsmen but simply ignored them, allowing the Space Marines to collect them for evacuation. By the time they returned to the docking area where the Salamander's Thunderhawks waited, a strange understanding had developed between the two groups. They had fought side by side against a common enemy. They had watched each other's backs, called out warnings when Genestealers attempted flanking maneuvers. I even shared ammunition when supplies ran low. It had not been friendship, not quite, but it had been cooperation, genuine and effective, and that was something neither side had thought possible. As they prepared to part ways, Grotzag approached Hephaestan one final time. "This is 3 times now," the Orc said. 3 times we found a way to work together instead of fighting. That ain't coincidence. That's something more." "It changes nothing," Hephaestan replied, but his voice lacked the conviction it once had. "You are still a Xenos, still an enemy of the Imperium. Next time we meet, we may be on opposite sides." "Maybe," Grotzag conceded, "but maybe not. Maybe we've proven that there's another way. Maybe we don't always got to be enemies." "The Imperium will never accept peace with Xenos," Hephaestan said. "It is against our fundamental nature as a species, our very reason for existing." "Then maybe the Imperium is wrong," Grotzag said quietly. "You ever think about that? Maybe all this war, all this hate, maybe it ain't necessary. Maybe we could find a better way, if we just tried." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither warrior was quite ready to confront. Hephaestus wanted to argue, to cite chapter and verse from the Imperial Creed about humanity's manifest destiny and the necessity of xenocide. But he found that he could not, because some part of him, that spark of humanity that the salamander's gene seed had allowed him to retain, agreed with Grotzag. Maybe the Imperium was wrong. Maybe the endless war that defined the 41st millennium was not inevitable. Maybe, just maybe, there could be another way. But saying so, even thinking so, was heresy of the highest order. And so Hephaestus said nothing, merely nodded to Grotzag and turned back to his squad. The orcs departed, heading to their ship through the corridors the Space Marines had cleared. The salamanders boarded their Thunderhawks and lifted off, leaving the Space Hulk behind to drift through the void. And both warriors carried with them the knowledge that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They had not just worked with the enemy. They had formed a bond, however fragile, with someone who should have been nothing more than a target for destruction. What that meant for their future, neither could say. But they both knew, with absolute certainty, that their relationship had fundamentally changed them. And through them, it might change the galaxy itself, one small act of cooperation at a time. The reckoning. All secrets eventually come to light, and the secret of Hephaestus's cooperation with Grotzag was no exception. It happened during a routine after-action review, 6 months after the Space Hulk incident. The company chaplain Adrax was reviewing reports from recent engagements when he noticed a discrepancy in Hephaestus's account of the Space Hulk operation. The report mentioned recovering Imperial Guard survivors from the Hulk, but the guardsmen, when questioned about their rescue, told a story that did not quite match Hephaestus's version of events. They spoke of orcs in the corridors, of watching Space Marines and Greenskins fighting side by side against Jenny Stealers. And they described coordination between the two groups that suggested more than a temporary cessation of hostilities, but actual cooperation. Adrax brought his concerns to Captain Mir-San, the commander of Hephaestus's company. Mir-San, a pragmatic warrior with 3 centuries of service, reviewed the evidence carefully. He questioned the guardsmen personally, examined Hephaestus's reports from multiple engagements, and began to notice a pattern. There were gaps in the accounts, details that did not quite add up, suggestions of deception. Hephaestus was summoned to the captain's quarters for what he knew would be an unpleasant conversation. He stood at attention before Mir-San's desk, his power armor removed, wearing only the simple black body glove that Space Marines wore beneath their ceramite shells. It was a deliberate choice by the captain, of forcing Hephaestus to face judgment without the physical and psychological protection that his armor provided. "Brother Sergeant Hephaestus," Mir-San began, his voice carefully neutral. "I have been reviewing your recent reports, and I have found certain inconsistencies that trouble me. I am giving you an opportunity to explain these inconsistencies before I take this matter to the chapter master." Hephaestus knew that this was his last chance to provide an acceptable explanation. He could lie, could attempt to explain away the discrepancies as errors in record-keeping or misunderstandings by the guardsmen. But he was tired of lying, tired of hiding what he had done. And some part of him believed that the truth, no matter how difficult, was better than continued deception. "I have cooperated with Xenos," Hephaestus said simply. "Multiple times over the past 18 months, always with the same Xenos commander, an orc war boss of the Bloodaxe clan named Grotzag. We have negotiated peaceful resolutions to conflicts, worked together against common enemies, and developed what might be termed a mutual understanding." The silence that followed this admission was deafening. Mir-San stared at Hephaestus with an expression that mixed shock, disgust, and something that might have been pity. Brother Chaplain Adrax, who had been standing in the corner of the room, made a sound that was half growl, half prayer. "You admit to heresy," Adrax said, his voice filled with horror. "You have betrayed your chapter, your Primarch, and the Emperor himself. This is apostasy of the highest order." "I have acted to preserve Imperial lives and assets," Hephaestus replied calmly. "I have found alternatives to costly battles that would have achieved the same strategic objectives with fewer casualties." My cooperation with the Xenos has never compromised humanity's interests. That is not for you to judge, Adrax roared, his composure finally breaking. The Xenos must be destroyed. There is no compromise, no negotiation, no cooperation. This is the foundation of our faith. To violate it is to betray everything we stand for. Brother Chaplain, Mirsan said quietly, please control yourself. This matter is serious, but shouting will not resolve it. Adrax fell silent, though his fury was evident in every line of his body. Mirsan turned back to Hephaestion, his expression troubled. You understand what you have done, the captain said. You have violated the most fundamental doctrines of the Imperium. Even if your actions produced positive results, even if they saved lives and preserved resources, they were still heretical. The law is clear on this matter. I understand, Hephaestion said, but I do not regret what I have done. I have seen that cooperation with Xenos is possible, that they are capable of honor and keeping agreements. To refuse to acknowledge this truth because it contradicts doctrine seems willfully blind. The doctrine exists for a reason, Mirsan replied. The Imperium has encountered countless Xenos species over its 10,000-year history. Almost without exception, they have proven hostile to humanity. The few that appeared peaceful initially revealed themselves to be threats given time. The policy of xenocide is based on bitter experience, not mere prejudice. I am not arguing for universal peace with all Xenos species, Hephaestion said. I am merely suggesting that perhaps some individual Xenos, like Grotzag, are capable of being more than enemies, that we might be missing opportunities for cooperation that could benefit humanity. Or we might be opening ourselves to manipulation and betrayal, Adrax interjected. Your cooperation with this orc could be exactly what it wants. It studies you, learns your weaknesses, and when the time is right, it will use that knowledge against you and the entire chapter. That is a possibility, Hephaestion conceded. But it is also possible that genuine cooperation could prevent conflicts that would otherwise cost lives on both sides. Mirsan stood and paced to the viewport that dominated one wall of his quarters. Through it, the eternal flame's home star was visible, a yellow sun not unlike ancient terrors. I am old, Hephaestion, the captain said quietly. I have seen 3 centuries of war. I have fought on 100 worlds against every enemy imaginable, and I have learned that the galaxy is cruel, that mercy is often repaid with treachery, that compassion can be a fatal weakness. He turned back to face Hephaestion. But I have also learned that the universe occasionally surprises us, that sometimes things we thought were impossible turn out to be merely improbable, and that rigid adherence to doctrine, while generally advisable, can sometimes blind us to opportunities we should explore. Captain, Adrax protested, surely you cannot be considering allowing this heresy to continue. I am considering all options, Mirsan replied. Brother Chaplain, you have correctly identified Hephaestion's actions as heretical under Imperial law. But I ask you, as a practical matter, what harm has his cooperation with this orc actually caused? Have Imperial interests been compromised? Have lives been lost that could have been saved? Has our chapter suffered any setback as a result of his actions? The harm is spiritual, Adrax insisted. He has polluted his soul through contact with the Xenos. He has opened himself to corruption and damnation. Even if his body has not yet suffered, his spirit surely has. With respect, Brother Chaplain, that is for the Emperor to judge, Mirsan said. Not for us. He returned to his desk and sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 300 years. Hephaestion, I find myself in an impossible position. By the letter of the law, when I should have you arrested and brought before the chapter master for judgment. You have confessed to heresy, and the punishment for heresy is death, or worse, servitorization. I understand, Hephaestion said simply. But, Mirsan continued, I also know you to be a warrior of exceptional skill and dedication. You have served this chapter faithfully for 2 centuries. You have never failed in your duty, never hesitated to place yourself in harm's way for your battle brothers. And most importantly, Despite your heretical cooperation with Xenos, you have never acted against humanity's interests. He paused, considering his next words carefully. I am going to make a decision that may cost me my own position. I am going to give you a choice, Hephaestion. You can face judgment for your actions, and knowing that judgment will almost certainly be harsh. Or you can volunteer for an assignment that will take you far from the chapter, where your unusual perspective on Xenos cooperation might actually be useful. Captain, Adrax objected, you cannot seriously be considering. I am captain of this company, Mirsan said firmly, and I will make the decisions regarding my warriors' deployment. Brother Chaplain, you are dismissed. Speak of this matter to no one. That is an order. Adrax left the room, his fury barely contained. When he was gone, Mirsan turned back to Hephaestion. The Death Watch, the captain said. Our chapter maintains a pledge to supply warriors to the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos. They hunt Xenos across the galaxy, often in situations that require creative solutions to complex problems. I am going to recommend you for secondment to the Death Watch. You will serve there for a term of no less than 10 years. If you survive and return, we will consider this matter closed. And if I refuse this option, Hephaestion asked, then I am bound by duty to report your heresy to the chapter master, and you will face whatever judgment he deems appropriate. The choice is yours, Brother Sergeant. It was not really a choice at all, and both of them knew it, but it was a chance to continue serving the Emperor, even if in exile from his chapter. And perhaps, in the ranks of the Death Watch, Hephaestion might find others who had learned, as he had, that the galaxy was more complex than doctrine suggested. I accept secondment to the Death Watch, Hephaestion said. When do I depart? Immediately, Mirsan replied. A Death Watch kill team is forming at Watch Station Ariok. You will travel there and report to the Watch Commander. Your tenure begins the moment you take the Death Watch oath. And Hephaestion? Yes, Captain? May the Emperor watch over you, Mirsan said quietly. You will need his protection where you are going. A spark in the dark. Hephaestion served with distinction in the Death Watch for 15 years, not the minimum 10 that had been specified in his sentence. He fought against Orc hordes on the fringes of the Octarius sector, purged Genestealer cults on a dozen worlds, and hunted Eldar corsairs through the webway itself. He proved himself a valuable member of his kill team. His tactical acumen and willingness to consider unconventional solutions making him an effective hunter of Xenos. But he never encountered Grotzag again. Yet the Orc warlord had vanished into the vast expanse of the galaxy, pursuing whatever objectives a Blood Axe warboss might have. Hephaestion often wondered what had become of his unlikely ally, whether Grotzag had survived, whether he still remembered their encounters. When Hephaestion finally returned to the Salamanders, he found a chapter that had changed during his absence. The wider galaxy had changed as well. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, had torn the Imperium in half, isolating entire sectors and making travel through the warp more dangerous than ever before. Primarch Raboot Gilliman had returned, assuming leadership of the Imperium and bringing with him new perspectives on how humanity should conduct its eternal war for survival. In this changed galaxy, Hephaestion's experiences with Grotzag seemed less heretical and more practical. The Imperium was beset on all sides, fighting wars on 1,000 fronts against enemies that threatened to overwhelm humanity's defenses. Resources were stretched to the breaking point. Every battle, every loss, brought humanity closer to its final defeat. In such circumstances, was it really heresy to consider alternatives to constant warfare? If cooperation with Xenos in specific circumstances could preserve human lives and resources for the truly existential threats like the Tyranids or Chaos, was that not actually the more faithful course of action? These were dangerous questions, ones that could still get Hephaestion executed if he voiced them too loudly. But they were also questions that more and more Imperial commanders were beginning to consider, even if they would never admit it publicly. Grotzag, for his part, Ed had survived and even thrived during Hephaestion's absence. He had risen to become a major war boss in his own right, commanding a fleet of several dozen ships and thousands of orcs. But he had never forgotten the lessons he learned from his encounters with the salamander. He continued to seek alternatives to mindless violence when possible, using negotiation and tactical thinking in addition to the traditional orc approach of just smashing things. Other orcs still viewed him with suspicion because of this, but they could not deny his effectiveness. His warband was wealthy, powerful, and successful. And success, in orc society, brought a lot of tolerance for unusual behavior. In the centuries that followed, there were reports, never confirmed, never officially acknowledged, or of a blood-axe warboss who sometimes negotiated with imperial forces rather than fighting them, who warned imperial commanders of tyrannid incursions, who stayed his hand when attacking targets that held large civilian populations, who seemed to operate by a code of conduct that was distinctly un-orky. And there were reports, equally unconfirmed, of a salamander's veteran who sometimes found alternatives to xenocide, who negotiated and compromised when doing so would preserve human lives, who seemed to believe that not all Xenos were irredeemable monsters. Whether these reports referred to Grotzag and Hephaestus specifically, or whether their example had inspired others to follow similar paths, none can say. The Imperium does not keep records of its heresies, and the orcs do not keep records at all. But somewhere in the vast darkness of the galaxy, two warriors who should have been eternal enemies had found a way to see past their differences. They had proven, if only to themselves, that cooperation was possible, that understanding could bridge even the widest gulfs, that friendship could form in the most unlikely circumstances. It was a small thing, perhaps. Two individuals in a galaxy of countless trillions, finding common ground in a universe built on endless conflict. But small things can have large consequences. Seeds, once planted, can grow in unexpected directions. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even the smallest spark of hope can shine like a beacon, showing that another way might be possible, if only we have the courage to seek it. If you found this story compelling, if it made you think about the nature of enmity and friendship, of doctrine and pragmatism, of rigid belief versus practical adaptation, then I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is vast, filled with countless stories of heroism, tragedy, and the occasional moment of unexpected grace. And we're here to explore them all, one tale at a time. Thank you for watching. May the Emperor protect, and may you find light even in the darkest places.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.